April 1945. 8.5 meters beneath the ruined garden of the old Reich Chancellery, a diesel generator hums behind a thin partition wall, and the air tastes of damp concrete and cigarette smoke. It is shortly after 3 in the afternoon. Around a narrow map table, crowded so tightly that elbows touch, stand the last officers of the Wehrmacht High Command. A situation map of Berlin, marked in colored pencil, shows a red pincer closing from the east and the north. General Alfred Jodl reports, in the flat, careful voice of a man delivering news he knows will not be believed, that SS General Felix Steiner's counterattack, the one Hitler ordered the day before, the one meant to save the capital, never happened. There were no reserves left to attack with. There never had been. For a long moment, nobody speaks. Then Hitler's voice fills the low concrete room, rising until it cracks, an eruption that those present would describe for the rest of their lives as the moment. The war, in his own mind, ended. He accuses his generals of betrayal, of cowardice, of lying to him for years. He announces, for the first time in front of witnesses, that the war is lost. And then, having said it, he does something stranger still. He decides to stay. Not to fly south to the Obersalzberg, not to lead a last defense from Bavaria, as his staff urged, but to remain in this hole in the ground and die alongside the city he had promised would never fall. That outburst in that room on that afternoon is as good a place as any to begin, because it captures something the surrender documents and the death certificates cannot, the sheer, grinding smallness of the space in which the Third Reich's final decisions were made. Armies of millions, the fate of a continent, the last acts of a regime that had murdered on an industrial scale, were by this point being decided by one increasingly erratic man in a room roughly the size of a suburban sitting room, cut off from most of his own country by broken telephone lines and advancing enemy armies. Understanding how those final decisions were made, and why they made catastrophe worse rather than better, tells us something essential about how the Nazi state actually worked, right to the very end. To understand why the war room mattered so much, you first have to understand how completely the ground had shifted beneath it. By January 1945, when Hitler moved permanently into the Führerbunker, Germany's strategic position had gone from difficult to nearly hopeless. The Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last great gamble in the West, had consumed irreplaceable reserves of fuel, armor, and trained men for a failure that cost upwards of 100,000 German casualties in a matter of weeks. In the east, the Soviet Vistula, Oder offensive, launched on January 12th, tore a hole in the German front nearly 300 kilometers wide and advanced, in places, 60 kilometers a day. Entire army groups that had existed on paper for years simply ceased to exist within a fortnight. What made the crisis different from earlier reversals at Stalingrad or in Normandy was that there was no longer any strategic depth left to trade for time. Germany, in early 1945, was a country roughly the size it had been before 1938, being attacked from both directions at once by armies that, combined, outnumbered what remained of the Wehrmacht by a factor commonly estimated at more than 3-to-1 in men and considerably more in tanks, aircraft, and artillery. Fuel production, dependent on synthetic plants that Allied bombing had spent a year methodically destroying, had fallen to a fraction of what frontline units required, so that tanks were frequently abandoned, not because they were destroyed, but because they had run dry. Ammunition production for the Army's field guns had likewise collapsed under the weight of round-the-clock bombing of the rail network that moved it. By this stage, formations that appeared on the situation map as full divisions were, in many recorded cases, reduced to a few hundred exhausted men, sometimes led by officers with only days of frontline experience, since the professional officer corps that had once filled such posts was by now dead, captured or scattered across 2 collapsing fronts. Replacements increasingly came from the Volkssturm, a home guard militia of boys as young as 14 and men well past conscription age, hurriedly armed with whatever rifles and improvised anti-tank weapons remained in depot stores. It is against this backdrop, an army being fought with children and pensioners while its most experienced formations lay destroyed in the Ardennes and on the Vistula, that the decisions made in the war room have to be understood. There was, by the spring of 1945, almost nothing left with which to execute the orders that continued to be issued with undiminished confidence. German command structure, in theory a sophisticated general staff system that had spent a century refining the art of maneuver warfare, had already been substantially undermined. Following the July 1944 assassination attempt, Hitler had grown pathologically suspicious of the professional officer corps, replacing experienced commanders with men chosen more for personal loyalty than competence, and increasingly bypassing the general staff altogether to issue orders directly to individual divisions and even regiments from his own map table. The problem the German war effort faced by early 1945, in other words, was not simply that it was losing. It was that the machinery meant to manage a fighting retreat, to trade space for time, to concentrate what few reserves remained where they might do some good, had been deliberately hollowed out from within, precisely when it was needed most. The physical apparatus into which this collapsing command structure now folded itself was the Führerbunker, a complex begun in 1943 and finished in early 1944, built beneath the existing air raid shelter of the old Chancellery specifically to withstand the bombing that senior Nazis knew was coming. It sat roughly 8.5 meters underground, its ceiling and walls up to 4 meters of reinforced concrete, connected by a stairway to the shallower Vorbunker above. Because it lay below Berlin's water table, pumps ran continuously simply to keep the floors from flooding, and the air, drawn through a ventilation system shared with a diesel generator, carried a permanent low tang of exhaust and damp. Roughly 30 rooms were arranged along a central corridor, half of it partitioned off and used, twice daily for the situation conference that had by now become the entire machinery of German strategic decision-making. This was the war room, if the phrase can be applied to a space perhaps the size of a modest dining room, in which a map table, several telephones, and a small crowd of generals, aides, and secretaries stood in for the General Staff, the Reich Chancellery, and effectively the government of Germany itself. Reports arrived by telephone where lines still functioned, and increasingly by courier, motorcyclist, or light aircraft where they did not, from army groups that in some cases could no longer be reached at all. Hitler, who by 1945 rarely left the complex except for short walks in the wrecked Chancellery garden, would study the map, move markers representing divisions that in reality existed at a fraction of their paper strength, and issue orders that assumed a freedom of movement and a supply of men and fuel that had simply ceased to exist above ground. Adjutants have described the peculiar quality of these sessions. A man in visibly declining physical health, hands trembling, addressing formations that were, by the time his instructions reached what remained of them, days out of date. The chain that carried decisions out of this room to the wider war was already badly frayed by the spring of 1945 and grew worse by the week. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel and General Jodl remained at Hitler's side throughout, the last vestige of formal high command, while General Hans Krebs, appointed Chief of the General Staff only in late March, inherited a staff function that had almost nothing left to coordinate. Martin Bormann, never a soldier, exercised enormous informal power simply through physical proximity, controlling access to Hitler, and in the war's final fortnight, effectively running what remained of civil administration from a desk a few doors from the map room. It was, in the most literal sense, government by whoever happened to be standing closest. Beyond the map room itself lay a suite of 6 rooms set aside for Hitler and his companion, Eva Braun, a small study dominated by a portrait of Frederick the Great, and cramped quarters for secretaries, a nurse, and Sergeant Rochus Misch, the switchboard operator through whom most surviving telephone traffic to the outside world now passed. Above, in the shallower Vorbunker, further staff and guards were billeted, while the undamaged wing of the old Chancellery still hosted afternoon conferences and a proper study for as long as the building above ground remained usable at all. Daily life settled into a grim, unvarying rhythm. Hitler rising close to midday, tea with his secretaries, the early afternoon situation conference, a second conference in the evening, and between them, air raids that shook dust from the concrete ceiling and pushed everyone who could fit into the corridor. Witnesses who survived the war would later describe an almost theatrical quality to the ritual. Officers standing rigidly around the map table reciting positions for divisions that, by the time the report reached Berlin, might already have ceased to exist. From that room in these final weeks illustrate exactly how the mechanism now worked, and how badly. On March 19, 1945, Hitler signed the order that would become known as the Nero Decree, instructing that all infrastructure of value to the enemy, bridges, factories, railways, waterworks, the entire framework a defeated civilian population would need simply to survive, be destroyed rather than left intact for the advancing Allies. Albert Speer, his armaments minister, had warned him days earlier that the war economy could sustain the fight for perhaps another 4 to 8 weeks regardless. Hitler's response was to order the destruction of the country anyway, on the reasoning, as he put it to Speer, that a nation which had failed to win did not deserve to survive its defeat. Speer, to his considerable risk, quietly ensured the order was never fully carried out, traveling to industrial regions ahead of demolition teams and persuading local commanders to disobey. It stands as one of the clearest documented instances of a subordinate simply refusing a direct Führer order in the war's final phase. A month later came the order to Steiner, on April 21st, to counterattack Soviet forces north of Berlin with formations that existed largely on paper, followed the next day by the explosion described at the opening of this account when Hitler learned the attack had never taken place. In its aftermath, he issued the order summoning General Walter Wenck's 12th Army, a scratch formation of barely trained boys and old men originally facing the Americans on the Elbe, to turn about and march to Berlin's relief instead, a movement that briefly reached the city's outskirts before being ground down entirely. When Hermann Göring, hearing of Hitler's stated intention to remain in Berlin, sent a telegram from Bavaria on April 23rd asking whether he should now assume leadership of the Reich as Hitler's designated successor, Bormann persuaded Hitler it was an act of treason. Göring was stripped of every office and title by radio message within hours. Heinrich Himmler's parallel attempt to negotiate a separate surrender through Swedish intermediaries, discovered by Hitler on April 28th, prompted a similarly furious dismissal of the SS leader in absentia, along with orders for his arrest. Each of these decisions, issued within days of one another from the same cramped room, shows a command structure no longer directing a war so much as consuming its own most senior figures, one after another. Alongside them ran a steady stream of orders establishing flying courts martial, drumhead tribunals with the authority to try and execute soldiers and officers accused of desertion or defeatism within hours, sometimes minutes, of arrest. Several such executions in Berlin's final days are documented from eyewitness accounts of bodies left hanging in public squares bearing placards naming their supposed crime. It is one of the starker illustrations of how the war room's decisions in this period were directed as much inward against the collapsing discipline of its own exhausted forces as outward against the advancing Allies. If you're finding this account of how it all actually unraveled interesting, a quick subscribe helps the channel more than you might think and costs nothing at all. Set against Allied command arrangements in these same weeks, the contrast could hardly be starker. At Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, General Dwight Eisenhower presided over a genuinely combined structure, drawing on British, American, Canadian, and French staff officers, in which subordinate commanders such as Montgomery, Bradley, and Patton retained real authority to manage their own fronts and were expected, within the bounds of overall strategy, to argue their case. Decisions moved through committees, through regular staff conferences, through a chain that, however fractious, functioned according to established procedure rather than the mood of a single man in a bunker. In London, Winston Churchill's War Cabinet likewise operated through structured, minuted meetings, with the Chiefs of Staff Committee providing sustained military advice that Churchill, for all his own strong opinions, was obliged to weigh against professional judgment he could not simply overrule by decree. American planning likewise built in a degree of institutional redundancy that the German system, by 1945, had entirely lost. The Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington and the combined Chiefs of Staff shared between Washington and London provided a standing body of professional military judgment that continued functioning regardless of which individual commander happened to be in the room, so that the removal or death of any single officer, however senior, would not have halted the flow of strategic decision-making. In the Führerbunker, by contrast, consequence passed through one man's judgment alone, filtered by whichever aide, Bormann most often, happened to have his ear that day. When Hitler's physical and mental condition deteriorated, as multiple witnesses describe it doing markedly through March and April, hands trembling so badly he sometimes struggled to hold a map pointer, there was no institutional mechanism capable of compensating for it. The system had no redundancy left at all. On the German side, an equivalent breakdown had in fact already occurred once before, in the winter of 1941 outside Moscow, when disagreements over strategy led Hitler to dismiss his army commander-in-chief and assume the role himself. Historians generally treat that moment as the point at which the German General Staff's collective judgment began to be permanently subordinated to Hitler's personal will. What the bunker weeks of April 1945 represent, in that sense, is not a new failure, but the final, most concentrated expression of a fault line that had been widening for 3.5 years, reaching a point where the war's last significant strategic decisions that would determine whether tens of thousands more soldiers and civilians lived or died in the war's final days, were being made without any functioning staff process behind them at all. The material consequences of this final phase are, in truth, difficult to disentangle from the consequences of Germany's defeat more broadly, since the country was going to lose the war regardless of what was decided in that room. What can be said with more confidence is that specific decisions, the refusal to allow tactical withdrawals that might have saved encircled formations, the insistence on holding cities as fortresses, that instead became death traps for their garrisons and civilian populations alike, measurably lengthened the fighting and multiplied the casualties in the war's last weeks, when the eventual outcome was no longer in genuine doubt. The psychological effect on the German officers who remained in the bunker is perhaps better documented than the material one. The diaries and post-war testimony of adjutants, secretaries, and generals describe an atmosphere closer to a court in the grip of collective delusion than a functioning headquarters, in which subordinates continued relaying and half-executing orders they privately knew to be meaningless, because the alternative, open refusal, remained almost unthinkable even in the war's final days. The site itself was largely destroyed by Soviet occupation forces and later East German authorities specifically to prevent it becoming a site of pilgrimage, and today an unmarked car park and a modest information board occupy the ground above where the map room once stood. There is, deliberately, almost nothing to see. The story survives instead in an unusually rich seam of first-hand testimony. Secretaries, telephone operators, surviving officers, much of it given to Allied and later German historians in the years after the war, which is precisely why the final weeks of the Third Reich's command are so much better documented, in granular, hour-by-hour detail, than almost any other phase of the conflict. Return, in the end, to that afternoon of April 22nd, to the map table and the colored pencil marks and the voice rising and cracking in a room built to survive bombs that could not, in the end, save it from the decisions made inside it. A war that had begun with blitzkrieg, with tanks moving faster than anyone thought war could move, ended with a man standing over a table the size of a dining table, ordering armies that no longer existed to save a city that was already lost. The Wehrmacht that had once conquered a continent in weeks now took its orders from a room 8.5 meters underground, cut off, waterlogged, running on a single diesel generator, its occupants increasingly unable to distinguish command from ritual. Germany did not lose the Second World War in that room, but the manner of its losing, the last, worst weeks of it, the fortresses held to the last man, the boys sent to die on the Elbe, the ministers dismissed by radio for imagined treason, was decided there by an apparatus that had ceased in every meaningful sense to be a general staff at all, and had become instead the last, airless chamber of one man's refusal to accept that the war was already over.